So the co-ops that seem to gel really well and have a strong, they could have all other problems going on, but if they were holding onto that space to meet together, and also if they could also have this somewhere to eat together and break bread and that be together in that way as well, outside of the economic function, kind of a dining hall, a meal room, a canteen, whatever it is, they are powerful spaces. They are powerful, powerful spaces, even in much bigger, well-established worker co-ops that I've encountered. That's one of the big lessons I took away from the YCN early days was everybody kept saying, we love just being here with other people and like sharing in solidarity and engaging with each other. This is what is giving us the strength to go back and fight the good fight and to keep things going and to keep trucking and avoid burnout. The more we can create worker co-ops that are able to individually and collectively sustain themselves and sustain themselves as an ecosystem, the stronger it will be and the more likely it is that sector, that movement will be able to survive and sustain the winds of change.
So today's guest is Owen Powell. In 2015, Owen began researching and then joined the Young Cooperators Network, a network of cooperators who were all under 30. Owen went on to complete a PhD exploring the challenge of sustaining horizontal collectivist democracy in worker cooperatives when they grow beyond 50 members, and continues to explore the challenges faced by worker cooperatives with the research group, a subgroup of workers.coop, the UK's Federation of Worker Cooperatives. Owen, welcome to Punchcard.
Hi, Caleb. Great to be here.
So even though you haven't been in a worker cooperative, you've obviously done a lot of your research on worker cooperatives. Can you explain what a worker cooperative is?
Yeah, to my mind, a worker co-op is an association of individuals who come together as equals and form an organization that they choose to label a worker cooperative, and that is by design intended to solely be controlled at the very deepest, or maybe at the very highest of decision making, a one member, one vote system. And that means that for me, a worker cooperative doesn't have shareholder-esque behavior that you might see from a firm with investors. It's about an organization that is established by and for the people who work there and is controlled entirely by the people who work there for the benefit primarily of the people who work there.
I'd like to start with talking a bit about what maybe politicized you, how you ended up in co-ops and exploring alternative economies.
So I think, interestingly for me, the UK and coming to the UK and then growing up here was a really key element to my political, I don't say awakening because it sounds really cheesy, but core education and core life experience, right? When I moved to the UK in 97 with my family and got to know the maternal side of my family, I very quickly realized that politics was very much alive and very much prominent on a number of different levels of people's lives in West Yorkshire. Even just the things I would hear maybe my grandmother say about Thatcher, or you would hear people reference that, not just family, but you would hear references to this and reference to kind of working class culture. My granddad was down pit, as they say, and that was his primary occupation. It was present and you could feel it. And when you ask the question, why are northern towns and cities dilapidated and run down and underinvested? But you start to gain this awareness as you enter your early teens, I guess, about class and that just creates this inevitable political dimension to it. But I wouldn't say I had a working class upbringing. Both my parents have been to university. My mum is the one who went on that journey. He was the one that went from a mining town in West Yorkshire to art school, to Manchester, to work abroad, to come back, to be able to earn sufficient money to buy her own house independently and to have that life prior to even meeting my father. So I think, there was a whole period there and it kind of solidified a left-leaning positioning. I got a bit more involved in the kind of scene and I went to study business and marketing at Bangor University with a view to working on the business side of the arts, right?
How does somebody who's kind of like interested in lefty things gravitate towards studying business? Because when I was young, vaguely sort of lefty, and I was just like, the antithesis of what I want to do is business. I've somehow ended up working in co-ops, which is a form of left-wing business. But did you just foresee that earlier, and you were just kind of like, business is necessary in capitalism, but it can be done in a in an interesting left-wing way?
I wanted to do something that was going to keep me engaged, that was going to provide me with both the opportunity to analyze and break down the systems that I both find interesting and also want to have the ability to challenge and understand and disassemble and rebuild in more positive and productive ways. But also, I knew I was quite good at that kind of stuff. I take to things like spreadsheets, like systems, like writing and structuring things quite well. And so I wanted something that was going to tool me up and also give me the credibility to then work with organizations, individuals. I saw a lot of opportunities there, and I saw a lot of opportunities to be at that interface between the creative and the what a lot of people consider the mundane, but what I actually find quite interesting, the business side of things, right? Like my politics tutor, I did terribly at college first time round. It's weird that I ended up doing a PhD. I was terrible, but I had this great politics tutor, and he would refer to Karl Marx as Karl, right? Like it was just the thing. And anyone that expressed any sort of vaguely fashy opinions was not literally, but sort of metaphorically stomped. He ran critical thinking and responsible environments. And all of a sudden, a load of kind of more political leanings, the readings I'd done, started to fall into place. He was like, I don't think you're going to be happy working in a corporation. You got to do a PhD. It was after that, a lecturer I had called Tony Dobbins, who's now a professor at Birmingham Business School. He agreed to supervise me for a master's by research rather than doing an ordinary master's, which I thought would be a good way to build myself towards a PhD. And when I presented a few different options to him, one was to continue down this big multinational route. One was to develop something else. I can't remember what. And option three was I'd heard about this organization called AltGen that were making a ruckus in London. These two young women called Constance Leisnay and Rhiannon Colvin. So I email Rhiannon, and simultaneously I start reading about co-ops. And I think that was the beginning of the slippery slope, or the beautiful rise into the world of co-ops and organizational democracy. And then that was the start of my research into the Young Cooperators Network and understanding what co-ops were, and understanding a lot of the kind of the philosophy and thinking about the history of co-ops and things like small level representative and participative democracy, high levels of equality between genders. And there was all this kind of interesting, more historical research. And in the meantime, Young Cooperators Network, when the research actually started, got me involved with the Worker Co-op Weekend, which I guess was for a long time the key place where people come, they learn a lot of the Worker Co-op movement in the UK.
I'd like to talk more about the Young Cooperators Network and your experience with that. Were you organizing with them, or were you just kind of getting a bit involved, seeing what they were doing?
So by the point that I got involved, the Young Cooperators Prize had happened. What happened there was Rhiannon and Constance, so AltGen, had caused enough of a stir, both nationally and even internationally, that there was kind of attention being paid to the need for this kind of post-crash generation, let's call it, to have alternatives presented to them, to the kind of conventional business model. And so the Young Cooperators Prize involved them going on a kind of tour of the UK to universities and I think some other spaces too, but primarily universities, maybe some colleges, to promote this prize funding, but also promote co-ops. And they had these amazingly designed stickers, and they had this whole media thing around it. I think that's how they got the attention of The Guardian. But by the time that I got involved with them, they'd already had one gathering, and then they were meeting in London, and they'd already got more people involved. So I think Johnny Gordon Farley from Stir to Action was on the scene. So we were already kind of a self-organizing entity. I very quickly became both a researcher and an active participant, if not an activist, within the Young Cooperators Network. And definitely by the time we went to our first Worker Co-op Weekend, God, I was so nervous when we went to that, because there were all these cool cooperators and all these interesting worker co-ops. It felt so wild. And then all of a sudden people get busy running the stuff. And I think at least a few people had voiced it early on, but perhaps we hadn't recognized the importance of it early on. The thing that was really gluing us together, and the thing people really wanted, was just to come together and be with other young cooperators, and to have that mutual trust and support, people you could call and people you might one day invite onto a podcast, or people, whatever it was, right? You kind of with Bread and Roses or Chapel Street, Martin Johnson, who I met through that, was like, we need a secretary. You've just finished your PhD. money's terrible. Come and help us. And so, they were getting a kind of co-op expert for nothing or no, as the case may be. And I'm there getting some amazing hands-on experiences actually working in a co-op after 5, 6 years of studying them. So actually what happened was once we ran out of steam, we would then meet up at the worker co-op weekends. I think that happened 2 or 3 times. And so it was a few years later when we met up and decided to use our unique skills to acquire a bit of funding from the co-op movement and try to re-energize the YCN. We ran these lunch and learns, tried to create these spaces for sharing and having dialogue. They went well, but things were patchy. The network secretary had to leave for personal reasons, and then we got a new one in, but they didn't really have enough time. It's just been like that with the YCN. And then the most recent thing, the Young Cooperators Weekend, and that was a deal that we made a year ago, which was we keep running out of steam. We haven't quite got the momentum that we need. We need to find a place for this in the co-op movement. We got Molly Newhouse involved, who's a bit of a young cooperator legend, I guess. I think she cut her teeth in Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op, but has since done conferences like Ways Forward. And she was like, I'm game for this. We get the funding, put me in the coordinating role, and we'll make it happen. But it's one of those things that I think there is a need for, there is a space, but where it goes or what it does next, who knows? But every so often, a bunch of us get a load of enthusiasm and make something happen. So it's a great vehicle for that.
I just want to kind of come back to what I think your professor is saying of like, you should do a PhD. And the fact that the study PhD academic environment is in some ways a lot more free than traditional capitalist employment. And I've had a friend say this to me as well. I mean, he said something along the lines of like, studying for a PhD is almost anarchic in some ways. I wonder if you disagree with that statement.
It was really poignant when my PhD finished that it felt simultaneously like I'd lost my kind of shield that I could kind of bat the world away with and just be like, oh, I'm busy. I'm doing my PhD. I don't want to do that right now. I'm okay, thank you. And also a kind of little bit of a bubble that had protected me from a lot of the more challenging aspects of life in late stage capitalism, whatever you want to refer to it as. So yeah, absolutely. I can totally see what you mean. It's a real privilege, especially if you can get a funded PhD. But I think the classic funded PhD is an amazing privilege and a type of freedom that you probably would struggle to find anywhere else.
Yeah, because it's like self-motivated study, basically, which is very different to being micromanaged by a boss in a big corporate institution or even a small cafe or any capitalist business. This interestingly plays into a theme throughout the first 3 episodes a little bit, where so Nacho was saying he had this immense amount of freedom because he squatted and so didn't have to pay for accommodation, wasn't paying council tax, presumably, and all these sorts of things. And that allowed him to work on the vegan cafe worker cooperatives. Obviously, you were being paid to actually study and you chose to study worker cooperatives. But do you think that space that you were given as a student, is that a part that allowed you to continue to explore worker co-ops, whereas otherwise you may have ended up in a more corporate path?
I could have easily ended up going down a corporate route. Fortunately, I wasn't wanted, or maybe I didn't want to be there. And I think that was probably one of the better things that's happened to me, because I got involved with running arts festivals. I got involved with social housing. I got a bit involved with housing co-ops. So that's when I shifted into a full-time academia. I think it's important to remember that previously in the UK, not in the not too distant past, the dole existed. And that dole existed not only for middle-class kids finishing university, but that dole also existed for people from working class backgrounds too. When we think about and we look at things like the punk movement, we look at little waves of artist movements that occurred in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and creativity and innovation, and eventually companies that emerged from that, and businesses both successful and cooperative, many worker co-ops, right? That dole that existed then gave a lot of those people space, time, freedom to think and explore and consider what they wanted to do and figure things out. Yeah. There are mechanisms by which that freedom can be given to a much wider group of people without necessarily feeling like you have to do a PhD. Again, I say a privilege and not something that I sort of wave away lightly.
So you did a thesis on worker cooperatives. Not many of those happen, probably because not many people know what the worker cooperatives are or are interested in them. But is that a hard thing to get funded?
I don't think it's impossible. And I think that there's a real opportunity at the moment to do work around alternative economics, of which worker cooperatives are a part. I think there's a lot of interest from institutions and organizations around the country, both funders and academic institutions alike. But I was internally funded. It's a lot more competitive to get funding from something like the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, which is one of the research councils. So unless you're going in for an institution that's already doing work around that area, and so they've already acquired the funding for you, gold dust to find that. My internal funding required me to work 100 hours a year. That was hugely beneficial because it meant I automatically got a teaching allocation, which put me in a much stronger position to be able to teach after my PhD, but also meant I was able to experience that side of academic life and learn and develop my skills around pedagogy, around facilitating seminars, which is remarkably similar to facilitating workshops.
That was very helpful. I mean, as somebody who doesn't know a huge amount about academic funding, but it sounded like a great opportunity for you. I was just curious if other people might be able to sort of wiggle their way through. Sounds like it's very difficult, but still possible. We were just talking about funding. So if you're enjoying Punchcard, then consider supporting us. If you too want to shift the conversation away from privately owned businesses to worker-controlled alternatives, then go to our funding page, which is openccollective.com/workers/projects/punchcard. It's a bit long, but it will be in the show notes, so you can just copy it from there. Open Collective might be a new platform to some of you. It's a bit like Patreon, but not run by venture capitalists. So even if you don't end up contributing towards Punchcard, I do recommend checking that out. So in 2021, you publish your thesis. The paper was a study of 4 large cooperatives, large having above 50 members, and also they had to have been established at least 20 years ago. It's called Creaking, Slipping, and the Goldilocks Zone, Cultivating Relevance in Established and Scaled Worker Cooperatives, which when I first read it, I had no idea what it meant. If you're listening and you don't know what it means, don't worry, we're going to go through some of it now. So co-ops have been around since the late 1800s ish, in the UK anyway. And there's been quite a lot of co-ops that started and then shifted away from cooperation, became less democratic, ended up being more hierarchical, ended up being like not really that recognizable as co-ops anymore. Is that something that motivated you to do this study? You were looking at large co-ops that had been around for a while, and you were asking the question, do they keep this cooperation, this democratic collectivism, and how do they keep it? Was that a bit of a motivation?
Yeah, for sure. I think there is a kind of internalized worry in the co-op movement. There's a whole travesty of the commons that you can get into around how common spaces or how cooperative spaces and organizations have been demutualized and undermined. A lot of the stuff I looked at was around like, what can co-ops do internally? Because I think that the more we can create worker co-ops that are able to individually and collectively sustain themselves and sustain themselves as an ecosystem, the stronger it will be, and the more likely it is that sector, that movement will be able to survive and sustain the winds of change. But that doesn't mean that I don't think there's a large reason why there isn't a proliferation of them and there aren't more co-ops in general, is that there isn't a favorable policy, legal, financial, let's call it a macro structural environment. So the emergence of a kind of whole cooperative ecosystem in the 1970s, and how quickly this whole cooperative sector kind of emerged, and then how quickly once that scaffolding was actively dismantled by Thatcher. If you put in a load of funding, you put in a whole funding regime and a load of development organizations, ultimately it is likely you're going to create a whole bunch of unsustainable organizations that as soon as that scaffolding is taken away are probably going to collapse. Or look how they've struggled in countries where you've had foreign direct investment pumped in, wiping out co-op sectors, and look at how co-ops that had just about survived through into the era of new labor suddenly found them facing a regime that was actively pursuing social enterprise. The organizations that, for the best will in the world, wanted to be set up as a or set up as a co-op, wanted to continue as a co-op, but the benefits of being a charity, if your primary function is to provide benefit to the community, and yes, you want to create a few meaningful jobs, but ultimately the rate relief and the ability to apply for additional funding as a charity or as a charitable trust, people move towards that avenue. So you're not just dealing with an internal potential fear, maybe co-ops can't do it, right? Can't cut it. And I guess that is part of the motivation, yes, they can. And here's the ones that have, and here's some really cool stuff about them. And since doing this, I've found more, right? Like, there's Dulles in North Wales that do amazing. They grew out of the Centre for Alternative Technology. They do amazing technological work. They do loads of the renewable consultation for Scottish government. They do a load for Wales. They make underground solar-powered vaccine fridges developed in the Eritrean War. They're based in the hills near Mach in North Wales. So there's co-ops doing all sorts of interesting stuff. Yes, I was motivated by the idea that there doesn't seem to be many of these. Why aren't there many of them getting to this scale? Why aren't there more worker co-ops? I think there should be loads of these things. They seem to be, to me, the logical way to run any small to medium enterprise. Like, why do we need hierarchical single entrepreneur businesses? But I think we can't forget that there's an external environment that isn't friendly.
So the question I had was, do you think that those 4 large cooperatives that you researched did maintain cooperative culture over the 20 plus years that they've been together and grown?
One of the key distinctions that I make around what the co-ops I was interested in were like was this idea about representative bureaucratic democracy. So pretty much anything involving kind of electing people to represent you. And that being the way that democratic legitimacy is maintained versus collectivist democratic organizing. And collectivist democratic is about that more, let's say it's a deeper type of democratic practice that involves making decisions either using consensus, which was very popular for a long period of time, or these days, more and more, you might find organizations making decisions using consent-based decision-making. Some of you might have heard of the term sociocracy, and that kind of sociocracy really has helped to galvanize and drive forward a kind of new wave of consent-based decision-making. But both of these are highly participative and involved. That was the word I was after, more involved type of democracy, a deeper, I would argue, type of democracy that requires a much richer involvement on the part of individuals within that. I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there. A really good delineation between that kind of collectivism and that representative bureaucratic type of democracy is by an academic called Rothschild. There's a whole load of work by her out there that's generally pretty accessible, that's good on that kind of differentiating between those types of democracy. Anyway, I was interested in that collectivist side. Now, all of the co-ops that I engaged with had at least some element within them that was determined to continue that kind of collectivist direct organizing. But of course, one of the things you will learn as you delve into the world of cooperatives and cooperation and into kind of direct democracy is that it is inherently imperfect and perpetually under strain or perpetually changing and evolving. And that's kind of in there lies its beauty, in there lies its frustration.
That actually brings me on to, so I'm definitely guilty of thinking that there's a perfect way of cooperating. And I was curious to know, like, were the people that you interviewed frustrated that they hadn't reached this perfect level, which is obviously a myth in and of itself?
I think when you're dealing with any organization, but particularly worker co-ops, the people you're going to first encounter, the ones you might find at the worker co-op weekend and the ones they're going to introduce you to for your first round of interviews tend to be the ones who are most heavily involved in a lot of the democratic systems or the democratic representation, or are the ones who take on coordination roles, or the ones who volunteer to go represent the co-op externally. And so they're going to have a certain kind of frustration. Interestingly, you might find within that group, those people that are like, I can see the organization breaking down. I can see how we're changing. I can see how more specialized roles or not training new members properly or not keeping a meeting room that's big enough to fit everybody is changing the co-op. Let's put those vocal members to one side, you start hearing about a different side of the frustrations where people are frustrated, although not necessarily frustrated enough to engage with it, but they are kind of feeling alienated in some way or feeling a sense of irrelevance to the co-op and what the co-op is, because they don't really know what all of those hyperactive members do, or they don't really understand why things have to be a particular way. And that shows, again, one of those challenges of time and scale, where things that were done for a particular reason at a given time don't keep getting explained and aren't being effectively communicated and permeating throughout the system. And I think these are some of those issues that create those kind of core frustrations. At the same time, Caleb, important to say, right, we focus on frustrations. There's a lot of people there using expletives before really positive things about their co-ops, effing beautiful, so bleeding frustrating, but I can't get out of this place. I'm never going to leave. The commitment that you find amongst members, both highly active and like externally facing and internal. The fact that people are there willing to have these really kind of intense, conflictive arguments, but they're not going to budge an inch because they love the organization they work for and they know that they're doing something very different. And that if maybe they went back to a conventional business or joined a convention, they'd find that transitionally difficult. So I think it's important not to just emphasize the frustration.
If we can just touch on some of the processes that you identified within the co-ops that you thought were good examples of how they manage some of these tensions.
I ended up crystallizing it all down to three things around focusing on the integration of members, the continuous kind of reviewing and renewing, and the turning outwards and engaging with the wider environment.
By integrating members, you essentially mean bringing in new members, skilling them up, making them feel involved, making them feel relevant.
One of the things I do talk about in my thesis is the need to be actively making space for people, not just new members necessarily, but for other members in general to be moving and orbiting and shifting around a collectivist democratic worker co-op. And even though, let's say, Jim or Sarah might be absolutely top-notch at finance, there should always be some kind of movement happening that's enabling someone else to come through or come across or come up, come down, to kind of be learning and developing that skill too, right? I think the difference between older and new members is newer members joining, well, they won't know any different. So if you've got new members joining a co-op and there isn't that movement happening, they're not being empowered. The co-op is only hiring because it needs more people to pack boxes or more people to bake cakes. But if you're creating these roles that are only going to be like grunt work, right, or only going to be certain types of work, then firstly, you might attract people who want to do other stuff, but then very quickly go, okay, well, either this isn't for me, or they say, okay, well, this is me now, and I'm okay with this. I'm going to take your orders and I'm going to just do what I'm told and I'm going to treat you like my manager. And all of a sudden, you've got a managerial dynamic occurring in a worker co-op. But I think there can be huge problems with older, more established members and the entitlement and the lack of willingness to move. They might have been in the same management or coordination role for 6 years. They might even act like they resent it, but they ain't moving out of it and they're not actively working to empower someone else to take over it. So what are you going to do? And what are you going to do when they retire or they drop dead or whatever else, right? So I think drawing those battle lines between new and older members is a risky business. But in terms of that notion of making space, that notion of creating the opportunity for people to enculture and be nurtured into a more active, participative, dynamic form of cooperation, the responsibility inevitably has to fall more greatly on the existing members, but the existing members as a whole, right? Number two was reviewing and renewing. I think the interesting thing there was as these worker co-ops were scaling, they could speak to instances where something that, let's say the HR team or group thought was bleedingly obvious, like a new sickness and leave policy, right? They just thought was just going to like pass through the members meeting, would be like a point of contention. Well, we've always, individually case by case approved sickness. And these HR guys are like, oh, that can't happen anymore. We're like a multi-million-pound company. We're going to get sued. Or at worst, we're going to treat someone badly. But at the same time, members aren't used to necessarily being the need for these kind of policies or for these kind of things that they feel out of control of. So I think that's a really key element to that reviewing and renewing. Isn't this thing where it's like perpetual change, perpetual motion. It's actually having that maturity and that clarity of mind to go, what are the things we can reasonably tackle right now, given we're also likely incredibly busy just being a business with the day-to-day, whatever it is, whether it was moving boxes or making bread or whatever the examples I gave earlier, right? Reviewing and renewing, I like it because of the alliteration, but it almost misses that like bit of that's the kind of like keeping things the same while also changing things. But I think that small c conservatism has a role to play in the survivability of co-ops. One of the key messages of my thesis, and perhaps Curie's to some extent too, and other work that's out there, is this balancing act, right? If we're going to survive in this relatively hostile environment, then actually we do need to be a bit cautious and a bit careful. So there's a role to play for it. It's not entirely detrimental, but it's definitely a force that needs to be kept in balance with that adaptability and with that desire for change.
What was number 3, the final one?
Turning outwards.
So yeah, and by that, you were, if I understand this correctly, you were referring to the idea of looking out and using external resources and kind of the wider co-op network, the wider co-op community.
One of the things people would sometimes refer to coming back from a worker co-op weekend with is like, yeah, I had a great time. I drank some beer, sang some song, went to some workshops. But I also found out about this really interesting approach to a particular part of the HR policy at this other worker co-op. Or I found out that these other 2 co-ops are having the same problem with this particular import-export issue as we are. So let's, combine forces on that. Also, in terms of just sharing culture, sharing some of the weight. In fact, all 3 are connected, I have to say, right? Because I think sharing some of the weight of that, integrating members and teaching them and empowering them and offering opportunities to realize what cooperation is. Well, cooperation exists both within the business and within the organization and within the movement. So things like the Worker Co-op Weekend, things like training from Principle 6 or from Co-ops UK or from workers.coop for sure, or any number of sources and spaces that are created. Having the confidence to engage with some of the conventional business world and be like, yeah, we're a co-op, but in a confident and potentially suspicious, skeptical way that's really careful. It helps avoid that exceptionalism, that like, ooh, they're not like us, so we're not going to be able to learn from them. We're not going to be able to take that. We have to solve all this ourselves. I know of a couple of examples. Dulles, again, have engaged the International Trade Body. They've got some serious high-level trade representation. Worker co-ops are serious businesses. And so turning outwards is both about a call to connect with the movement, but also a call to put themselves out there, because otherwise, how are more people going to encounter worker co-ops and realize that they're serious, amazing, interesting, dynamic, vibrant entities?
Well, now they're going to encounter them through this wonderful podcast.
Oh, there you go. There you go. One more way to discover co-ops.
So what would you say to a co-op that here's that list of 3, goes, fantastic, Owen, you did a great job researching, come up with these great things. We would love to do them, but they're expensive. We can't do them. What's your rebuttal? Because also it's difficult to do. A lot of people try buddy systems and they try all these things and it's quite draining and it sort of maybe falls apart a bit.
The more of you that can be together at a given time, probably the better. And that's the cheapest thing you can do, right? So the co-ops that seem to gel really well and have a strong, they could have all other problems going on, but if they are holding onto that space to meet together, and also if they could also have this somewhere to eat together and break bread and that be together in that way as well, outside of the economic function, kind of a dining hall, a meal room, a canteen, whatever it is, they are powerful spaces. They are powerful, powerful spaces, even in much bigger, well-established worker co-ops that I've encountered. And I think that's a really interesting thing to pay attention to. I don't have any quick fixes for like an HR policy. I'm sure that if you talk to someone in the movement, if you get in touch with workers.coop or you get in touch with Barefoot and you're looking for that kind of advice and guidance, there are people out there.
What I really liked was when you said meeting together. I think that's simple enough and clear enough that like everybody can grasp and do something about that. You don't have to create the full new member trajectory plan. It's just about meeting together more. Okay, so thinking a little bit about how academic work can continue to feed into the worker co-op ecosystem and network and the federation. Obviously, you've been working with workers.coop since its inception in the research book group with Kiri and Matt. Do you want to speak a little bit about what you've been able to do and how you've been able to support and how that's actually ended up changing workers.coop, which I think is quite novel. I don't know of any worker co-ops that have three researchers just hanging out doing research for them. It's quite an interesting potential there of like what could be done and what could be learned.
So, but all three of us had been involved in and researching around and engaged with the worker co-op movement for a number of years prior to workers.coop, which was previously kind of called the Fed as a sort of loose project name. Just to be clear as to what distinguishes workers.coop from maybe other federal organizations is that a conscious decision was made to at least attempt to set it up in a distributed manner where it was going to try and avoid becoming one of these highly stratified, hierarchical, representative apex organizations. So becoming another Co-ops UK or Co-ops Europe and other such organizations. So didn't want to do that, wanted to do something more distributed, wanted to do something a bit more networked, was interested in trying to do something with consent-based decision making and making that as integral and central to the way it would function as possible. Wow, all of that sounds incredible and interesting. So three researchers sitting on the bench were like, well, obviously this is something we should be tracking. So we got permission. We did our first round of interviews. We pulled that data together and we presented a report back to the board or the kind of coordinating group. And they said, okay, cool. This is all kind of, powerful stuff, but what are we meant to do with it? What are your recommendations? And we were like, well, we're kind of researchers. We're not really supposed to do that. It becomes like you could become like a kind of like, okay, well, didn't make it past the research group or sort of this kind of like think tank-esque malign force or benevolent force, as the case may be. So there's kind of an awareness of that and a consciousness of that.
Can I just
Yeah.
unpick that? I find it quite interesting that you're very cautious about presenting advice or recommendations. And, if you've done research, in my mind, you're pretty well suited to make some recommendations. Obviously, there's lived experience as well, but you're just making recommendations. You're not saying live or die by my research. Worker co-ops are extremely stretched. And if you've done research, I think people will just be happy to know what the hell you did and to hear what analysis has come of it.
It's about the power you've been entrusted with because in any process of kind of converting interview data or any kind of data and interpreting that data, there's a power that comes with that. And the ease with which you could begin to impose your own ideas is problematic when you're trying to maintain an organization that's based upon, and the thing that holds it together is a sense of mutual relevance and interdependence. If people start seeing their ideas being mullered away by being churned through this research machine, like some kind of meat grinder or something, then they don't recognize what comes out of that, then that could be problematic. I hear what you're saying. Most people are going to be accepting it, but there's a little bit of cautiousness. But ultimately, I think overall, by and large, it went down well. And I recall there was a couple of people who reacted kind of like to it, a sharp inhale of breath. And later on, were like, actually, that was kind of useful. Probably needed to hear that, or that probably was good that came out. And good that it was also communicated by this kind of like third party almost thing, right? Which is kind of handy. Then we did a second round of those about 6 months later. And again, quite a few significant developments had occurred. And so what we did using the research we've done so far, we ran a workshop, a kind of long form workshop, maybe 2 or 3 hours. And Kerry did a really amazing job, really tightening that up, bringing it together, running a couple more mini workshops online, and then has helped operationalize some of that into the organization.
The work that you're doing for workers.coop is making it much more reactive to the views held by the members. Because you progressed us through where you spoke to 20, then in the second round, you spoke to a slightly larger group of people, then you had a massive workshop. I think some of this may have happened, but having you three holding it, steering it with your experience, I think has been almost infinitely helpful and has made it, this big, like hard to control distributed membership feel more connected to the central stuff that's going on. Because this podcast is called Punchcard, I like to ask the people who come on what you do when you punch out of work and what you would probably be doing if you weren't sitting here with me.
It feels like a really semi-permeable membrane around work for me. Like I enjoy the teaching I do, but that is within the kind of stuff that I'm paid for at the university that I work at. But the reality for me is that I love this stuff. Yeah, I love going to the pub and having a pint. But going to the pub and having a pint isn't good enough. I had to get co-opted onto the board of the local community co-op pub. And I like being involved with that. And I'm willing to give my time and my energy to that. But I don't feel that's me punching in and out. Like there's the work I do to get paid, put food on the table, keep a roof over my head. I enjoy that work. I'm privileged to enjoy that work. Touch wood, that continues for many years to come. But I actively pursue a range of different projects. I run a co-working space. So it's using a community interest company model, but we behave very much like a co-op. And we set that up a couple of years ago above a brewery in the center of York. I'm involved with the community co-op pub, plot and plan various festivals and ideas with friends. I'm involved with the Young Cooperators Network.
You're extremely lucky. This just continues to bring you joy and gives you happiness and energy. Have you ever experienced burnout?
Yeah, man. It's so easy to get towards that point of burnout and to feel that coming. And I think it's pretty vital to stay engaged and to find spaces where you can engage, but also aren't going to just suck the life out of you. I think that's always a risk. It was something we actively didn't want to occur with the Young Cooperators Weekend. That's one of the big lessons I took away from the YCN early days was everybody kept saying, we love just being here with other people and like sharing in solidarity and engaging with each other. This is what is giving us the strength to run our organizations, to go back and fight the good fight and to keep things going and to keep trucking and avoid burnout. And then we started getting really bogged down in like how a network should work and how decisions would be made. And all of a sudden things ground to a halt. There's something in that, finding spaces where you can be fulfilled and like re-energized, but still remain mission driven, still remain kind of focused. I know I'm getting burnout when I just feel like everything's against me. I mean, even just the mess in the kitchen in the morning, whatever it is, these little things. And if you feel like it's all against you, that is a real big red flashing warning light, I think, for indications of burnout, at least for me. I'm sure it's different for other people, but it's something to watch out for, something to be careful of.
I think that's something wise that you just said around keeping a watchful mind out for burnout, in the sense that when you're starting to feel tired and you're starting to feel like things are against you, that is a good time to reassess. But I just want to echo your sentiment that I also am really interested in bringing co-op and socialness together. So we've got a little housing co-op group and we meet for drinks. We kind of just hang out and chat. We meet in the park when it's sunny and we do maybe a little bit of work and research. But again, that shows my tendency towards being a little nerd like you. And I'm sure not everybody would appreciate that, to be their pub hangout time, also talk about co-ops. So we're going to leave it there. Thanks, Owen, so much for being with me for almost 3 hours.
Has it been that long? No, thank you, Caleb. And I wish you and the pod and all of the listeners all the best for whatever you're working on. Yeah, I hope the pod continues. We'll have to keep pushing it out there and hopefully get some crowd momentum behind you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Punchcard is released monthly, so look out for the next episode. If you enjoyed listening, please consider supporting Punchcard by going to our Open Collective page at opencollective.com/workerscoop/projects/punchcard and starting a monthly contribution. We currently have seed funding for the first 3 episodes from workers.coop, but we will need your support to be able to keep Punchcard running after that. If you are interested in finding out more about worker cooperatives, then check out workers.coop's website, and don't be shy to send any questions you have or ask for support by emailing solidarity@workers.coop.